My son-in-law scheduled a scrap metal truck to haul away my garage full of what he called junk, 3 days before I ever found out about it. He had no idea one of those cars alone was worth more than his entire house. My son Greg found me in the garage on a Sunday afternoon, wiping down the hood of a car I had spent 22 years bringing back to life, one part at a time. "Dad," he said, standing in the doorway with his hands in his pockets, the way he used to stand there as a boy when he was about to admit he'd broken something. "Paige and I need to talk to you about something." Paige was already walking across the driveway toward us, a folder tucked under her arm, her heels clicking against the concrete in that brisk, decided way she walked, when she'd already made up her mind about something, before the conversation had even started. "Walter," she said, using my full name the way she always did. Never Walt, never Dad. "We toured a wonderful community last week, Maplewood Senior Living, beautiful grounds, a full-time nursing staff, activities every single day." "I don't need a nursing staff," I said, setting down my rag. "I need a socket wrench and about 6 more hours of daylight." Greg gave a small, uncomfortable laugh. Paige did not. "We've already put down a deposit," she said, "for a unit opening up in 3 weeks." I stood there in my own garage, in front of a car I'd rebuilt, with my own 2 hands, and felt something cold settle into my chest. "You put down a deposit," I repeated slowly, "without asking me." "We were going to tell you today," Greg said quickly. "We just wanted to have all the details worked out first, so it wouldn't feel overwhelming." Paige opened her folder and pulled out another sheet of paper. "There's one more thing. The house will need to be staged and listed quickly once you move. And honestly, Walter, all of this," she gestured toward the 5 cars lined up under the garage lights, tarps pulled back, decades of Sunday afternoons and Saturday mornings represented in every one of them. "This really needs to go. I already spoke with a scrap and salvage company. They can be here Wednesday morning to clear it all out." For a moment, I couldn't find any words at all. "Wednesday," I finally said. "This Wednesday." "It's for the best," Paige said, and I watched her glance, almost dismissively, at the car directly beside me. A 1969 Dodge Charger, deep candy apple red. The same car my late wife Dorothy had ridden in on our very first date. The same car I had spent over 2 decades slowly, painstakingly restoring after we bought its rusted, forgotten shell at an estate sale for $400. Paige looked at it the way you'd look at a broken washing machine sitting at the curb. "It's just old junk taking up space, Walter," she said. "Nobody's going to want any of it." I looked at my son, 44 years old, standing beside his wife, saying nothing while she scheduled the disposal of 22 years of my life like it was a line item on a moving checklist. "Dad," Greg said carefully, "it's not that we don't understand what the cars mean to you. It's just realistically, at some point, somebody has to deal with all of this. Better it happens now while we can help than later, when it might be harder." "Harder for who?" I asked. "Me or the 2 of you?" He didn't answer that. Paige glanced at her watch, the way she does when a conversation has stopped being useful to her. "You have no idea what you're talking about," I said quietly. Paige's expression didn't soften. If anything, it hardened slightly, the way people's faces do when they've already decided you're the unreasonable one in the room. "We're doing this for you, Dad," Greg said. "We just want you safe." I looked past both of them, at the Charger sitting under the garage lights, and thought about Dottie sitting in that passenger seat on a warm evening in 1971, laughing at something I'd said, completely unaware that 50 years later, a stranger would be standing in front of it calling it junk. "Get that scrap truck canceled," I said. "Today?" "Walter," Paige started. "Today," I said again, and this time my voice left no room for negotiation. I had absolutely no idea, standing in that garage that afternoon, just how close I had come to losing something far more valuable than either of them could possibly have understood. 5 weeks earlier. "My name is Walter Kowalski. I spent 35 years on the assembly line at a Ford plant just outside Dearborn, Michigan, building cars for other people to drive away in, while I clocked out every evening and drove home in whatever second-hand vehicle I could keep running that month. It wasn't glamorous work, but it paid the mortgage, and it gave me something else I never expected. It gave me an education in exactly how a car is built, piece by piece, bolt by bolt, an education that would end up shaping most of my life outside of work as well. My wife Dorothy, everyone called her Dottie, and I were married 46 years before her heart gave out 3 years ago. Suddenly, on an ordinary Thursday morning, while she was watering the ferns on our back porch. I still keep those ferns alive. I've never once let them die, no matter how many times I've had to replace a pot or fight off root rot. Some things you simply refuse to let go of. We met at a drive-in diner in 1970. when I was 20 years old, and driving a beat-up hand-me-down Chevy that barely started most mornings. Dottie worked the counter. She used to say she fell for me because I tipped generously, even though my car looked like it belonged in a junkyard. I used to tell her I fell for her because she was the only person who ever made me feel like more than just a factory worker with grease permanently under his fingernails. A year into dating, I found a rusted, stripped-down 1969 Dodge Charger shell at an estate sale. No engine, no interior, half the body eaten through with rust. I paid $400 for it, more money than I could really afford at the time, and told Dottie I was going to bring it back to life. She laughed and said, "Well, you'd better hurry up, because I'm not marrying a man who can't finish what he starts." We married 2 years later, in a small church outside Dearborn, and moved into a modest 3-bedroom house with a detached garage that I promised her, only half joking, would someday hold something worth showing off. For the first several years, that garage held nothing but a half-stripped Charger shell up on jack stands and a growing collection of parts catalogs I studied at the kitchen table like scripture. Dottie never once complained about the noise, the grease-stained rags piling up in the laundry, or the weekends I spent out there instead of in front of the television. She used to bring me coffee around 9 o'clock most Saturday nights, set it on the workbench without a word, and sit on an overturned bucket for 20 minutes, just watching me work, asking questions about carburetors and compression ratios she genuinely wanted answered. Most wives would resent a garage like this, I told her once. Most wives didn't watch you save every extra dollar for 2 years just to buy a rusted shell instead of a new couch, she said. I'm not most wives, Walter. It took me 22 years working nights and weekends between raising our son and paying our bills, but I finished it. Dottie rode in that Charger on our first real date after I restored it, and again on our 50th wedding anniversary, the year before she passed, wearing the same shade of red lipstick she'd worn the very first time she climbed into that passenger seat decades earlier. Over the following years, I restored 4 more classic cars in that same garage, each one a slower, quieter kind of therapy after long days on the assembly line, each one carrying its own small piece of our life together somewhere in its bones. Our son Greg grew up around all of it, handing me wrenches as a boy, though somewhere along the way, as an adult, cars stopped meaning anything to him beyond a way to get to work. I remember him telling me once, maybe 14 years old, that he'd rather be inside watching football with his friends than standing in a hot garage passing me tools all afternoon. I hadn't pushed him. I figured, foolishly perhaps, that he'd come around to it eventually, the way I had. He never quite did. He went into medical supply sales instead, married Paige, a real estate agent with sharp instincts and an even sharper sense of what other people's property was worth. I wanted to like Paige. I tried for years. She was competent, driven, the kind of woman who could walk into any room and immediately identify its resale value. At first, that felt like an asset to the family. Slowly, it started to feel like something else entirely. After Dottie passed, Greg and Paige began visiting more often. At first, it felt like exactly the comfort I needed. Sunday dinners, Paige bringing over casseroles, Greg mowing my lawn on weekends. Then, slowly, the comments started. "This house is a lot for one person to maintain, Walter. You know, some of these senior communities have incredible amenities now, really more like resorts than nursing homes. That garage is just accumulating clutter, don't you think? It might really open up the whole property. Small pebbles, never a boulder." I told myself, the way lonely men often do, that they were simply being thoughtful. About 4 weeks before that Sunday in the garage, Paige came by while I was working on the Charger's carburetor. She stood in the doorway for a long moment, watching. "You know," she said, "properties with detached garages like this are extremely desirable right now. If it were cleared out and finished properly, it could really increase the home's value." "It's finished the way I want it," I said. She smiled, the kind of smile that doesn't quite reach a person's eyes. "Of course, Walter. I'm just saying, for the future." I should have heard something underneath that comment. I didn't, not fully. I went back to the carburetor and let the moment pass. A week later, my old friend from the plant, Sal Marino, a man I'd worked the line beside for nearly 3 decades, stopped by while I was hosing down the driveway. "You got a minute, Walt?" "For you, always, Sal." He scratched at the back of his neck, the way he always did when something was sitting uneasy with him. "I saw your daughter-in-law downtown last week, at Riley's Scrap and Salvage, talking pretty seriously with the owner, from what I could tell." I straightened up. "Scrap and Salvage?" "Didn't want to say anything unless I was sure," Sal said, "but I heard your address mentioned before I stepped away." "She's probably just curious about pricing," I said, though even as I said it, the words didn't sit comfortably. Sal looked at me for a long moment. You trust that woman, Walt? She's my son's wife. That's not what I asked. I didn't have a good answer for him that day. Before he left, he clapped my shoulder and said, "The way old friends do, anything you need, day or night, you call me." I thought he was just being a good friend. He was trying to warn me. Around that same time, a certified letter arrived from an auction house in Scottsdale, Arizona, addressed to me directly. I set it on the kitchen counter, told myself I'd deal with it once I had a quiet afternoon free, and let it sit there, unopened, for nearly 2 weeks. That, I can tell you now, was very nearly the most costly mistake of this entire ordeal. If a certified letter arrives regarding something you care about, open it immediately. Don't let it wait the way I nearly did. Meanwhile, unknown to me, Paige's staging and property consulting business had taken on significant financial strain. She had personally guaranteed loans on 2 properties she planned to flip, expecting a quick turnaround in a market that had cooled far faster than she'd projected. Both properties sat unsold for months, carrying costs piling up every week. Greg's sales commissions had also slipped after his company restructured his territory, cutting his income nearly in half without either of them telling me a word of it. And the fastest, cleanest source of cash they could imagine was my house, cleared, staged, and sold, with the garage and everything inside it hauled away as an inconvenience rather than examined as an asset. Of course, I knew none of this yet. Whenever they visited, Paige smiled warmly. Whenever Greg hugged me goodbye, I hugged him back and told myself, foolishly, that my son's family was simply growing closer to me now that Dottie was gone. Then came that Sunday afternoon in the garage, the folder, the scrap truck scheduled for Wednesday morning, and the moment I told them both to cancel it. They left that day without agreeing to anything. Paige's expression, walking back to her car, told me clearly this conversation was far from finished. I was right. 3 days later, on Tuesday evening, I finally opened that certified letter that had been sitting on my counter for nearly 2 weeks. It was from Renner & Associates, a nationally recognized classic car appraisal and auction firm based in Scottsdale, confirming receipt of documentation I had quietly submitted months earlier regarding my 1969 Dodge Charger RT, and informing me that, following formal appraisal and authentication of its numbers-matching engine and original build sheet, a serious private buyer had submitted a formal offer. I sat down at my kitchen table and read the number twice to make sure I hadn't misread it. $340,000. I actually laughed out loud, alone in my kitchen, because my mind simply refused to process that figure attached to a car I had once bought as a rusted shell for $400 at an estate sale. I called the number listed on the letterhead first thing Wednesday morning, the very same morning the scrap truck had originally been scheduled to arrive. A woman named Diane, an appraisal coordinator, confirmed everything. The offer was genuine. The buyer was prepared to move quickly. And she mentioned something else that stopped me cold. "Mr. Kowalski, based on the photographs and documentation you sent us for your other vehicles as well, our senior appraiser, Mike Renner, would very much like to schedule an in-person evaluation of your full collection. Preliminary estimates suggest significant additional value." 3 days later, on Friday morning, Mike Renner himself drove up from Ohio to evaluate the rest of the collection in person. He was a quiet, methodical man in his 60s, the kind of person who ran his hand along a fender the way a doctor might examine a patient, patient and unhurried, occasionally murmuring numbers into a small recorder as he worked. Sal came by to keep me company while Mike worked his way slowly around each car, a 1967 Camaro, a 1970 Chevelle, a 1965 Mustang Fastback, and a 1971 Plymouth Barracuda, each one representing a different decade of my life, with Dottie, a different set of Saturday mornings. "These are exceptional, Mr. Kowalski," Mike said, straightening up after nearly 3 hours of careful inspection. "Numbers-matching engines on 3 of the 4. Original interiors preserved, or period-correct restorations on all of them. Documentation is immaculate. Frankly, I don't see collections maintained this meticulously very often anymore." "What are we looking at?" Sal asked, before I could bring myself to. Mike flipped back through several pages of handwritten notes. "Conservatively, combined, I'd estimate the remaining 4 vehicles at just over $310,000. Combined with the Charger offer already on the table, you're looking at a collection worth roughly $650,000, Mr. Kowalski." I had to sit down on an overturned bucket, the same one Dottie used to sit on decades earlier, sipping her coffee and asking me questions about compression ratios. $650,000, I repeated quietly, sitting in my garage, that my son's wife called junk. Mike gave a small, sympathetic smile. People underestimate what patience and consistency build over 20-30 years, Mr. Kowalski. It happens more often than you'd think. Usually it's the person who built it slowly who understands the value best, and everyone standing outside it who sees only clutter. That afternoon, still absorbing everything Mike had told me, I called my attorney, a sharp, no-nonsense woman named Diane Castellano, who had handled Dottie's and my estate planning years earlier. When I told her everything, from the scrap truck to the appraisal letter to Mike Renner's visit that very morning, she asked me to come in immediately. "Walter," she said, once I'd explained the whole situation, "do you remember, about 8 years ago, shortly before Dottie's health began declining, the two of you came in to update your estate plan?" I remembered vaguely. Dottie had insisted, her words exactly, that we get things properly protected, just in case. "You created a revocable trust," Diane continued, "and Dottie specifically wanted your car collection titled separately within it, with an explicit clause preventing the vehicles from being sold, scrapped, donated, or otherwise disposed of without your direct written consent, regardless of any power of attorney or guardianship arrangement that might arise in the future." I stared at her. Why would she build in protection like that 8 years ago? Nobody was threatening the cars back then. Diane hesitated. She mentioned at the time a conversation she'd overheard between Paige and a friend at a family barbecue. Something about how the garage would make a wonderful expanded kitchen someday. "Dottie told me directly, and I wrote it into my notes, that she wanted you protected, Walter. Even from family. Especially from family." I sat in that office chair, absorbing that slowly. Dottie had seen this coming, years before I ever let myself consider it possible. "Which means," Diane said, "that scrap truck, or any future attempt to sell or dispose of those vehicles without your direct approval, has no legal standing whatsoever. Your trust makes that impossible." For the second time that week, I felt the ground shift beneath me, except now it was shifting entirely in my favor. That same afternoon, I sat down with my financial advisor, a steady, plain-spoken man named Carl Bishop, who had managed my modest retirement accounts since shortly after Dottie's passing. When I explained everything, the trust, the appraisal, the $650,000 sitting quietly in my garage for years, he leaned back in his chair and shook his head slowly. "Walter," he said, "between your pension, your Social Security, and your retirement savings, you were never in any real financial danger, even before any of this happened. Now, frankly, you're sitting on more security than most people your age ever see in their lifetime. Nobody, and I mean nobody, needs to be making decisions about your living situation on your behalf. You're the one holding all the cards here, whether anyone else in your family realizes it yet or not." I hadn't lost anything over those 2 uncertain weeks. I had simply, briefly, allowed myself to believe I might. Now, when people imagine revenge, they usually picture something loud, dramatic, immediate. In my experience, real consequences tend to arrive quietly instead, the way a small crack spreads slowly through a foundation until, one ordinary morning, the whole structure begins to lean. That Wednesday morning, despite my direct instruction to cancel it, a scrap and salvage truck actually turned into my driveway just after 8 o'clock. I stood in my doorway in disbelief, watching 2 men in coveralls step out and begin surveying the garage. "Morning," one of them called out cheerfully. "We're here for the pickup. Everything in the garage, right?" "Nothing in that garage is going anywhere," I said, walking toward them. "Who scheduled this?" The driver checked his clipboard. "Paige Kowalski, confirmed for this morning." I called Sal before the truck had even finished backing out of my driveway. He arrived within 15 minutes, and together we made sure every vehicle title, every appraisal document, every piece of paperwork proving legal ownership within an irrevocable trust was photographed, copied, and secured, just in case anyone attempted this again. That afternoon, I called Greg directly. "A scrap truck showed up at my house this morning," I said, "after I specifically told you both to cancel it." There was a long pause on the line. Paige said she'd take care of canceling it. I thought she had. "Did she?" I asked. "Or did she just tell you that?" He didn't have an answer for me. That evening, Paige called, her voice tight and clipped. "Walter, I'm sorry about the miscommunication with the truck, but we really do need to move forward with clearing that space." "Paige," I said calmly, "those cars are legally protected inside a trust my late wife established 8 years ago. They cannot be sold, scrapped, or removed without my direct written consent. Not by you, not by Greg, not by anyone." Silence stretched out on the line. "That's not possible," she finally said. "It's very possible," I said. And it already happened, years before either of us had this conversation. The cracks in their plan widened quickly after that. A week later, Sal called me. "You sitting down, Walt?" Always a good sign when you open with that. "Heard through a guy I know downtown that Paige has 2 properties sitting unsold, both carrying loans she personally guaranteed. Apparently the bank's been calling." Diane later confirmed something similar. Paige's staging business was carrying substantially more debt than either she or Greg had let on, and without access to my property as collateral or quick cash, the pressure on both properties was mounting fast. One evening, driving past their neighborhood to drop off a birthday gift for my grandson Ben, I saw Greg and Paige arguing in their driveway, voices sharp enough to carry across the yard. "You told me the trust thing was a bluff," Greg shouted. "How was I supposed to know his dead wife thought that far ahead?" Paige snapped back. Through the front window, I could see my granddaughter Lily standing frozen in the hallway, watching the way children always watch, quietly and remembering everything. I didn't stay long enough to hear more. Some arguments don't belong to anyone but the people standing inside them. That night, my grandson Ben called me, his voice careful. "Grandpa, Mom and Dad have been fighting a lot." "I know, buddy. I'm sorry you're hearing that. Is it about the cars?" I paused. "A little bit, yeah. I like the red one," he said quietly. "Grandma used to let me sit in it sometimes, remember? She said it was a piece of history." My throat tightened. She was right about that, buddy. More right than any of us realized. A week later, Greg showed up at my door alone, without Paige, for the first time in longer than I could remember. "Can we talk?" he asked. "Always," I said, stepping aside. We sat at my kitchen table, the same table where Dottie and I had once planned our own wedding, 50-some years earlier. "I didn't know about Mom's trust," he said quietly. "I swear I didn't." "I believe you," I said. "I didn't fully know either, honestly, until Diane reminded me." He rubbed both hands over his face. "Paige has been telling me the properties would turn around any month now." I believed her. I wanted to believe her. He looked up. "The truck? The assisted living deposit? All of it. It was about our debt, wasn't it? Not about you." "I think it started that way," I said carefully. "I think somewhere along the line, you both convinced yourselves it was for my own good, because that was easier to live with." He was quiet for a long moment. "The Charger," he finally said. "I don't even really remember it from when I was a kid. I was too busy being annoyed you were always out in that garage instead of watching football with me." "I remember," I said. "I used to feel guilty about that, actually." "Don't," he said. "I get it now. Mom used to say that car was the only thing that ever fully relaxed you after a long week on the line." She wasn't wrong. He reached into his jacket and pulled out an old photograph, one I hadn't seen in years. Dottie, sitting in the passenger seat of the freshly restored Charger, laughing at the camera, the day I'd finally finished the restoration. "I found this going through some of Mom's old boxes," he said. "I think you should have it back." I held that photograph for a long moment, feeling something loosen in my chest that had been tight for weeks. "I don't expect forgiveness," Greg said. "I just wanted you to know I'm sorry. Really sorry." I believed him. Not because of the apology itself, but because, for the first time in longer than I could remember, he wasn't asking me for a single thing. Paige did not come to apologize that week, or the next. Diane later informed me that she and Greg had begun seeing a financial counselor together, attempting to untangle the debt she had kept largely hidden from him for over a year. Then, nearly a month after Greg's visit, Paige called and asked, quietly and without her usual clipped confidence, whether she could meet me somewhere neutral. Not my house, not theirs. A small diner off the highway, the kind of place with worn vinyl booths, and a waitress who calls everyone honey, regardless of whether she's ever met them before. She was already seated when I arrived, hands wrapped tightly around a coffee mug she never once drank from. "Thank you for coming," she said. I slid into the booth across from her. "You said it was important." She nodded slowly, staring down at the table for a long moment before finally speaking. "I owe you an apology, Walter. A real one, not the kind I gave you on the phone that day." I stayed quiet, letting her find her own way there. "I've spent the last 2 years terrified," she said. "Terrified my business was failing. Terrified of what that meant for Greg, for Ben and Lily, for how people would see me if it all came apart in public. And somewhere in the middle of that fear, I looked at your garage, and I saw dollar signs and clear square footage instead of 40 years of your life. I told myself I was helping you. I wasn't. I was helping myself, and I dressed it up as concern because that was easier to live with." "That took some courage to say out loud," I told her honestly. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said. "I just needed you to hear it directly, from me. not filtered through Greg or an attorney's letter. I appreciate that, I said. But Paige, I need you to understand something. Whatever happens between you and Greg, whatever happens with your business, those cars, this house, none of it is ever going to be leverage again. Not for you, not for anyone. I understand, she said quietly. I think I finally do. We didn't hug goodbye. We didn't promise Sunday dinners the following week. But she thanked me again on her way out. And for the first time in longer than I could remember, I believed every word she said to me was true. Whatever happened between them going forward, I understood, was theirs to work through, not mine to fix. About 6 weeks after that Sunday afternoon in the garage, I made a decision. I called Diane at the auction house back in Scottsdale. I'd like to accept the offer on the Charger, I told her. There was a pause on her end. Are you certain, Mr. Kowalski? That car clearly means a great deal to you. It does, I said, which is exactly why I think it's time it goes to someone who'll appreciate what it represents, rather than sitting in a garage collecting dust while my own family fights over whether it's worth anything at all. The sale closed 3 weeks later. The buyer, as it turned out, was a retired airline pilot from Ohio who had been searching for a numbers-matching '69 Charger for over a decade. When he came to pick it up personally, I told him the whole story, about Dottie, about the estate sale, about 22 years of Sunday afternoons. He shook my hand and said quietly, I promise you, this car is going somewhere it'll be loved. I believed him completely. With part of the proceeds, I set up a small education trust for Ben and Lily, untouchable by anyone but them, released only for college or trade school tuition. I kept the remaining 4 cars in my collection, now formally appraised and insured at their true value, for the first time in decades, and I kept my house, exactly as it was, garage and all. Greg started coming by on Saturday mornings again, not to talk about assisted living or property staging, but simply to hand me wrenches the way he used to as a boy, slowly relearning an interest in the cars he'd once dismissed as clutter taking up space. 8 months after the sale, Sal talked me into entering my remaining 4 cars in the annual classic car show held downtown every autumn, something Dottie had asked me to do for years, and I had always found some excuse to avoid. This time, I brought Greg, Ben, and Lily along with me, all 3 of them helping polish chrome and vacuum interiors the night before, Ben asking more questions about compression ratios in one evening than Greg had asked in his entire childhood. We won 2nd place in the muscle car division with the Chevelle, a small trophy that now sits on my mantle beside a photograph of Dottie. Standing beside the car afterward, Ben tugged on my sleeve. Grandpa, can you teach me how to do this? Like, really teach me, not just watch? I looked at Greg, half expecting him to redirect his son towards something more practical. Instead, Greg simply smiled and said, Yeah, buddy, I think that's a great idea. That evening, driving home with grease still under my fingernails for the first time in longer than I could remember, without a hint of loneliness attached to it, I felt something settle in my chest that had been unsettled since long before that Sunday afternoon in the garage. One evening, nearly a year after that Sunday in the garage, Greg and I sat on the back porch watching Ben attempt, with limited success, to identify the difference between a socket wrench and a ratchet. I still think about that day, Greg admitted, when you told us we had no idea what we were talking about. I remember, I said. I thought you meant the money, he said, that we were underestimating what the cars were worth. I was, I agreed. But that's not really what I meant. He looked at me. What did you mean? I meant you had no idea what any of it actually represented, I said. Not the dollar figure, the years, your mother, all of it. He nodded slowly, watching his son struggle happily with a wrench in the driveway. I think I understand that now, he said. It just took losing almost all of it to get there. If you've stayed with me this long, here is what I hope you take from my story. Value isn't always visible to the people standing closest to it. Sometimes the things quietly built over decades, a marriage, a restoration project, a collection, a life, look like clutter to someone in a hurry, and look like everything to the person who built it one patient afternoon at a time. I think about Dottie often, sitting on that overturned bucket decades ago, asking me questions about carburetors she genuinely wanted answered, seeing worth in something the rest of the world would have driven straight past without a second glance. She saw it in that rusted Charger shell in 1971, and somehow, even from years beyond her own passing, she saw exactly what might threaten it decades later, and quietly made sure it couldn't be taken. That, more than any dollar figure an appraiser could ever attach to 4 wheels and an engine block, is the inheritance I carry with me now. Not the $650,000. The patience, The willingness to look closely at something before deciding what it's worth. If someone in your family calls your life's work junk, don't be afraid to ask them to look closer before it's gone for good. And if you're lucky enough to have someone who loved you enough to protect what mattered, years before you ever saw the danger coming, take a moment to be grateful for that kind of quiet, patient love while you still can. If this story reminded you of someone in your own life, I would be honored if you shared it with them. And if you'd like more stories about family, quiet sacrifice, and the truth that always seems to find its way home, eventually, stay close. There are more stories still to come. Thank you for spending this time with me.